okay, what's going on with the bees? And I can tell you right now, it's not good. All right. Status, bee populations are going down. And just to let you know, when I talk about bees, what I mean is native bees, not honeybees. I will touch on honeybees a little bit, but they sort of have a whole other scenario going on right now. So talking native bees, their status is declining. Some of that we know for sure, some of it we don't really know. The trend is not good, it's going down. Although some species are staying about stable, other ones are crashing like crazy. We don't really know why. The drivers, we're getting a little bit better handle on it, and I'll talk about those. The thresholds, I would say, no freaking clue. We don't know what the thresholds are for how many of our bees can we lose before we're really in trouble. I think people are familiar with some of the publications that have come out recently with the insect apocalypse, where we've lost 70% of our insect biomass. And I think we're starting to see what's happening as a result of that when you look at what's happening with our grassland birds, which they feel is, pretty directly connected to the fact that they got nothing to eat, right? And anytime you take away the bottom of the pyramid, we're going to see issues going up. So it's not good. One thing I'll tell you, don't use this cartoon when you go and talk to like grade 2 or 3 kids. 8-year-olds don't think it's funny. You would not questions.
Quite ominous, yeah.
Here in grade 3.
So we're gonna die? I'm like, no, honey, we're not really gonna die. It's just let's move on from that slide. Yeah, so don't do that. So sometimes people point out, it's like, okay, there are more pollinators than just bees, right? Yes, there are lots of pollinators, right? Moths, butterflies, flies, there are a lot of things out there. We tend to focus on bees when we talk about issues in pollination for 3 simple reasons. Bees are obligates when it comes to nectar and pollen. Because when you talk about, for example, butterflies or moths, their host plant as a caterpillar is a whole different of a whole different importance to them, and their life cycles are quite different. Flies, they're kind of all over the place. They're not territorial. Wasps, they have a variety of life histories, right, where some of them eat pollen a little bit, and then the rest they eat is meat and all this. So they're quite variable. So we stick a lot to bees. They also show flower consistency, which means they really like certain types of flowers. So you can look at the relationships within the food webs, and you can talk a little more clearly about what's going on with certain guilds of bees and their association with their flowers. And they're nest-centric foragers, which means, of course, where their nest is, you can map out where their territory is. So you can start to draw those associations between the abundance and diversity of bee that you see in that area along with the land use. So it's sort of a tidier picture when you're looking at these creatures. And they're beautiful. Look at those faces.
Fuzzy. And they're fuzzy.
Fuzzy faces. I can look at those all day. They're gorgeous. Oh, and I have boxes of bees. They were out there before, and I've got a magnifying glass. Want to take a look at these. This is just a small voucher collection that I take around when I'm doing talks to students. So this was one of the first slides that I had, was that we have about 218 species of bee. Well, since I put this together about 6-7 years ago, we've had quite a jump in capacity here in Manitoba learning about our bees. Dr. Jason Gibbs came to U of M. Now we have Dr. Kyle Bobby Wash. Both were trained with Lawrence Packer at York. I mean, these guys, they really know their bees, and Jason is like fantastic resource to have here in Manitoba, because he's a taxonomist and he is the go-to guy in North America when it comes to species like the Lassia blossoms and things like that. So when we heard that he was moving to U of M, right away I thought, okay, he doesn't know this yet, but he's my new best friend. And I'm gonna find ways to get him money to help keep him here and help grow more entomologists, because we just didn't really have that expertise here in Manitoba. So it's quite exciting. There's also Corey Sheffield, Dr. Butterfield. He's in Regina at the museum there. Fantastic resource. He's the one that sort of did the 218 number on a few of the studies that he was involved with. But now, with having Jason looking at the samples that were in past collections, and then samples that people like myself and he and his students are taking, we're up to about 350 species plus. Sometimes people get excited, they're like, wow, new species. It's like, well, really, it's just we weren't looking before. We weren't looking and we didn't have the expertise. Now we have the expertise. So it's not really that we have more bees, we just know we have more bees. And some of them are really quite interesting. I won't talk too much about it, because hopefully I'll have all my results to talk about in about 6 months or so. But one bee that we found quite close to here in Forest, the closest other occurrence we have for that bee is New Mexico. I was like, how the heck is this bee in Forest, Manitoba, when it should be in Mexico, associated with the desert? So needless to say, we really triple checked that. We did DNA barcoding on it. We did everything to make sure that that was the bee.
Anybody from Forest been to New Mexico lately?
Well,
They came in their, packed
I shouldn't
in
say
their
the
bag
landowner,
and
but I
they
do know the landowner
arrived
has traveled a
in
bit, but
wild weather.
I don't know how it ended up in our cup. So that
Yeah.
was super cool. You know, so we're learning more and more, which is fantastic, because a lot of times we get asked questions about bees and we can make inferences based on studies that are going on in other jurisdictions, and we try and talk about what we know so far, but we're getting more confident as we're actually doing the studies here in Manitoba. So I mentioned that when I say bees, I mean native bees. A lot of people associate it actually with honeybees. So this is the distinction I like to try and make for people, is that honeybees are considered livestock under the Agricultural Act. So they're like cows, right? They are not native to Canada. Brought them over, you know, in like the 1700s from Europe, and they survive in Canada with, you know, intensive human husbandry. So think of them as like cows, whereas, you know, our native bees are more like deer, elk, polar bears, etc. That's a really important distinction to make, because then the issues facing European honeybees versus native bees are very different. Just the same way the issues facing cows and facing elk are very different. You know, so it's important for people to understand that, because we have to help them understand that these issues are complex. It's not just as easy as going out and raising more hives, because that's actually not going to help us at all, because quite frankly, honeybees are not particularly good pollinators. Really the bulk of the pollination is done by our native bees, and our native species of plants absolutely need our native bees. They are just not pollinated as efficiently by honeybees. Generally, you know, our native bees need three, I guess you could call them four things. So they need a place to live, they need stuff to eat for the entire season, and they need protection from toxins, poisons, neonics, etc., and mechanical damage. Mechanical damage is something that we don't talk a lot about, but about 80% of our native bees are ground nesters. So when you think about Agro-Manitoba, how much of Agro-Manitoba is subjected to tillage? Pretty much all of it. So then it gives you an idea of that it's not just enough to have, you know, scraps of wildflowers and things like that. You need big areas of undisturbed, untilled soil, which you just don't have a lot of these days. So these are the basic causes of declines, right? The intensification of agriculture. So it's not just that the area is expanding, it's also within the area that we have agriculture, it's intensifying. So people are squaring off, right? Wetlands continue to be drained, habitat gets lost even in the headlands and the marginal lands. Pesticides, neonics are in the news all the time. I'm not going to touch on those. That's a whole other talk. They're under review.
Yeah,
They're banned in Europe, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. Of course, habitat loss and fragmentation. It's not just that the quality is going down, but the habitat's outright lost, and then those corridors in between the habitat is being lost. Diseases and parasites are becoming more and more of an issue because, of course, we have those in the domestic bees, and the domestic bees, they're free ranging, right? So they are transmitting diseases to our native populations, which when you get mites or things like that in a hive, domestic hive, well, generally they either die or they're disposed of, right? Or they're treated with antibiotics, things like that. Well, we can't do that to our native populations, and we see that over and over again, right, with transmission of diseases from domestic stock to our wild stock, things like that. So it happens all the time. It's happening with our bees. All of you, I'm sure, have seen on Facebook the Albert Einstein quote that if the bees go, we're all going to die in 4 years. First off, he didn't say that. Second off, it's not true. Chances of us losing every single species of bee is pretty slim, and usually when they do that quote, sometimes they morph it to say honeybees. We would have a lot of issues without insects, that's for sure. Because about 70% of our food supply relies on insect-mediated pollination. So we would have huge health impacts, food scarcity, insecurity, and of course, what I point out to people, no coffee, no chocolate, no spices, no nuts, no
scare a lot of people into action.
Vegetables, yeah. So, and of course, when we hear about climate change and things like that, we talk about that there are certain parts of the world that are going to feel those impacts more strongly. And unfortunately, with the loss in pollinators, those same places that are facing those disproportionate issues with climate change are also more vulnerable to the loss of their pollinators simply because of the crops that they grow. Although we're not immune to that either, Canada, we rank about 4th out of 16 that when we see catastrophic declines in our pollinators, one of our biggest crops, of course, is canola. So it is insect mediated. Down further south, it's the fruit crops and the vegetable crops and things like that that will see an impact. And the stakes are getting higher. This is the Aggie in me that's coming out a little bit here because I find this part pretty stark. Is that, yeah, the pollinators are declining, and at the same time that we're losing our pollinators, the amount of crops that we're growing that are insect dependent is it's doubled here in North America, and globally we've seen an increase of about 300%. So at the same time that we're seeing the pollinators decline, the need for this type of food is going up, and the deficits are getting greater. And we've been able to overcome some of those through technological advances, right? Because we're breeding new species of plants, and look at what's happened to corn since we got involved. Potatoes, all that kind of stuff. Also technological advances with GPS enabled seeding and everything like that. It's pretty phenomenal. But the yield increases in those in the crops that need insects is not keeping pace. So other things are exceeding it because we've been able to overcome issues with soil fertility and moisture deficits and things like that through innovation. But we're not seeing that innovation come up to account for those deficits in pollination. Really, when it comes down to it, habitat is the main driver for native bees in agroecosystems. And some people say, well, we've got all these mass flowering crops, right? Think of all those acres and acres of canola and flax and all this kind of stuff. Well, that's not enough to feed our bees. So, even if you were to ignore the fact that they can't use any of those acres for nesting, which they so critically need, you take a look at the blue bar there, that represents the blooming time for canola, and the orange bars are the flight patterns for the bees. So of course the important thing is that they need something to eat from the time they emerge until the time they die, right? So the mass flowering crops, even if you overlay all the different crops, it's still that intensive part in the middle of the summer, and it's just not enough. So you need habitat to make up for that. And what's interesting is that One of the things that first got my unit interested in pollination, and this was, Mark Wannick really started this probably 10 years ago, something like that, is because they were looking at big sections of canola, and they were seeing big dips in yield in the middle, and they couldn't figure out why. They had accounted for, you know, water, soil fertility, wind patterns, seeding, everything like that, but then they realized it's like, oh, well, a bee will only fly so far. It's like, what? You know, all that technology, all the advances in agriculture couldn't overcome the fact that bees will only fly so far away from their nest. The smaller the bee, the smaller the flight pattern that they'll go. So the really small bees will only go about 50 meters. And they don't even want to go 50 meters, right? Just think about where you grocery shop, right? You grocery shop as close to your house as possible. So the farther they have to go away for food, then the more vulnerable they are to either the elements, getting hit by a raindrop, a car, getting eaten, anything like that. So they want their food as close as possible. And that, keep in mind, they can't really make nests within a canola field because they get plowed under. So the middle of a canola field, a quarter section, is 400 meters. So when you're looking at how far a bee will fly, you're restricted to much larger bees. So then right away, actually the bulk of our species in Manitoba are those smaller bees. It's the same, you know, in Alberta and things like that. It's just the bigger a bee gets, the fewer there are of them. It's like with anything with big mammals, right? Big fierce things are rare. Anyway, one of the studies that I was doing that I'm still writing up is we put cups on the margins of canola fields, and then we put cups within the canola field during blooming time, because we want to see, okay, what exactly is that decay rate between what you're getting in abundance and diversity of bees on your margins versus when you go all the way into the field. Stay tuned. But yeah, so when you're looking at habitat fragmentation, you start to understand why the scale and connectedness of those pieces becomes so important, because they have to be able to fly there, you know, or else they just can't get it. So one of the things that we've been looking at, a few different agencies, is habitat assessments. So what do we have left within these altered systems? So we've been using the Xerces guide. Xerces, they're like the be all and the end all when it comes to invertebrate research. Check out their stuff. They've got everything out there. So we've been working with NCC as well to modify the Xerces habitat assessment to make sure that it's valid for Manitoba. And I know that NCC was looking at changing how it deals with larger, more intact systems, because the pollinator habitat assessment from Xerces was designed for the altered ecosystems of you know, the agro-ecosystem. So what we do within that is we look at vegetation zones, basically, and we're looking for the amount of habitat, quality of habitat, nesting availability, and then we also look at farm management practices. And then what we're trying to do is take a look at, okay, once we put all those pieces together and we sample the bees as well, what does the diversity and abundance of bees in that area tell us? And then what do we see with the land use? And when you do that same comparison over multiple sites, then you start to get an idea of what that land mosaic needs to be in order to support a good population of bees. This is what they kind of look like. This site was actually on the low road to Shiloh. Some people might recognize it. So, you know, on this one, if you see the totals on here, annual cropping is only about 40%. That's pretty rare. Most of my sites, annual cropping was anywhere from 75 to 90%, 95. Sometimes you just look and it's like, is there any bees here at all? You know, because it's just the roadways keeping them alive, right? But that's just the reality of the situation in most of southern Manitoba. So we're going to use what we know and start to map out that mosaic and make some suggestions over what type of management responses we can make, right? And anyone here heard about the Living Labs program. Yeah, so Living Labs, it's sort of shorthand for Ag Canada's new approach to how we're doing ecosystem resiliency work and the more environmental pieces of what we do there. So there, right now, Manitoba and Prince Edward Island were announced as the first 2 living labs, so we should start doing field work this coming summer. Then there will be a living lab in Quebec, one in Ontario, and then one in BC. And it's an approach because it's very, it's based in co-development, million partners. Again, I could do a whole other 1-hour talk on this, so I'm giving you just the shorthand. But it's also place-based, because what we're doing is we're working with landowners to identify the priorities that they have in what research they think we need to do, which is a bit of a flip, because previously what we've done is, hey, you know what, we think that this is what we need to research, and then you need to do it on your farm. But we're like, hey, the management practices that we're suggesting just aren't really getting the uptake that we want, so why don't we ask the producers what it is that they need us to answer, and then we'll go out and research it. We have 1 million partners on this because there's an internal component where we're getting about $6 million over the 3 years, and then we have an external component, about $4 million over 4 years. That's headed up by the Manitoba Conservation Districts Association. They hold the pen on that, but the partners are, you know, NCC CAPS in their conservation districts, IISD, which is International Institute for Sustainable Development. So we're all working together to look at doing some really unique type of research, and then also looking at socioeconomic barriers. So, you know, we think this is an awesome practice, but no one adopts it. It's like, so why? What, you know, what's the technological barrier, and then maybe are there socioeconomic barriers as to why you don't adopt it? So under the Living Labs here in Manitoba, they identified greenhouse gases, water quantity, not so much quality, there's a little bit in there, soil health, and biodiversity. So the biodiversity component has other things that I'm looking at, my kind of pet projects, wild pigs, predators, and livestock, things like that. But then a good portion of it is pollinators. So we're focusing again on that landscape mosaic. So taking a look at the quantity of habitat that's available, the quantity, and then the connectedness between them. And the other thing we're going to do is take a look at, okay, well, what agricultural best management practices are being used, and how can we amplify any potential biodiversity value of that. For example, if a producer needs to do erosion control on grass runway, it's like, okay, well, you got to plant plants, right? So can we plant plants on there that also have pollinator potential, right? So it's just real simple tweaks to stuff that people are already doing, but improve the biodiversity value. And coming out of this, as I mentioned, you know, it's going to be all across Canada. So right now we're working on the protocols to institute standardized biodiversity monitoring within all of those Living Lab sites. So we're looking at the beneficials, and the beneficials is just shorthand for pollinators, and then natural enemies of crop pests. We're looking at birds, so doing breeding bird surveys, things like that. Vascular plants, so native plants for that, and then also soil arthropods. And then hopefully we'll get lots of good data, because at the same time that we're collecting the biodiversity data, we have other experts that are doing all the soil testing, water quality, every kind of sort of ag perimeter that you can imagine is going on. So we'll have a really good database to support the biodiversity monitoring on top of that. Get to the end. So I've got to point out resources and partners. We put the plug in for Bee City Brandon. Sherry, are people watching? Bee City? One, it's probably my Auntie Tootie. BC, she promised that she'd watch. Anyway, so, you know, Bee City, we got certified here in Brandon as a Bee City. So what that means is we're, you know, trying to do a push for extension education events, also some habitat installations, things like that. for Grannon, but we've got lots of other partners. NCC, pollinatorpartnership.org is a fantastic resource if you're looking for planting guides, things like that. Of course, Xerxes, they're, you know, the grand poobah, the be all, the end all. Living Prairie Museum, and a new organization in Manitoba called Be Better Manitoba. So they've partnered with us on the Pollinator Party last
June.
Yeah, Pollinator Party, we're gonna have another one.
Everybody dresses like a bee.
Oh, Pollinator Party, we gave talks, there were kids' crafts, we had displays. It was awesome. Exactly, you can say that louder. Ain't no party like a pollinator party, because the pollinator party don't stop.
I wanted to get it on the shirt.
That'd be a big shirt. Would be a big shirt.
Anyway, so I covered a lot. Just sort of skimmed everything on there. Does anyone have any questions?
Got caught looking at bees. Oh.
Yeah.
So I have a question. So, so this past summer we put in a nice big garden, which included some native flowers and things like that for the bees, and because we also want to grow things like squash, we need to be pollinated.
Yep.
So we found it took a long time for bees to actually come into our yard, which I don't know if that's normal. So I felt like we had the flowers for them, but how do we encourage good habitat in our urban yard for them?
Like, doing exactly what you did, which is planting flowers. You know, you do see those bee houses.
Yeah,
They do work. You have to be patient with everything, and of course, we've got some good information on Xerxes. Sherry, do we have it on Bee City yet for our guides? Because there are just some tips on what to avoid on your bee houses, which is, you know, no plastic, things like that. You got to make sure you keep them clean at the end of every spring, things like that. But really, you know, it's like the Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. It might take a bit. When we give recommendations on pollinator plantings, what we ask or what we recommend that people do is ensure that you've got blooms all season, so spring, summer, fall, right? Because stuff is pretty lean in the spring, so if you can, you know, really bump up your spring stuff, that would probably bring them a little bit more strongly. Make sure you have a variety of colors, because for example, when we're trapping bees, we use white, blue, and yellow. Because different species of bee likes different colors at different times of the year, and it's the same with all native bees. With normal flowers, they like different colors, and they like different shapes. So, you know, some bees like a really flat flower, some of the more long-tongue bees, you know, will go for that cone-shaped flower. You know, so yeah, you can hit all those high spots.
But native, you mentioned a lot of them are ground nesters.
Yes.
So the house wouldn't be really something that would attract them, is it?
No, those would be your stem nesters.
Okay.
People like them because then you get to see them. For the
Right.
ground nesters, if you can leave some ground with that's bare.
Bare is even better,
well-drained,
is good.
Yeah, bare is better. I didn't include it, but I've got some slides that show. Generally, if you've seen a whole bunch of things that look like anthills, they're probably not anthills. Those are bee houses, but they look like anthills. If you just stand there for a little bit, if it's an anthill, then the ants will be coming and going, right? But if it's bees, then nothing will come out for a bit, and then all of a sudden you'll see a bee. Because even though 90% of our bees are solitary, they're still considered kind of eusocial in that they all like similar habitat, and habitat's hard to come by, right? So they will group together. So you'll see lots of different entrances, and then we do have some bees that will share an entrance with multiple chambers underneath. So they don't help each other take care of, you know, their eggs or their larvae, but they'll share an entrance because it helps dissuade predators from coming down into their nest if you've got lots of bees to protect that area.
Are tiger beetles a predator of bees?
Not so much.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I mean, if they got in there, yeah,
Yeah.
because they're predatory.
Yeah, right.
But
Yeah.
they don't specifically target them.
Okay.
No.
And any ones more specific to like sandy soil? There'd be certain bees there versus
Yeah,
like the more rich kind of soils, that sort of thing.
it varies by
It does?
species. Yeah. Good. Hardly say.
there resources out there for identifying bees that you might have in your yard? I think I do.
Yeah.
I have a pretty good wildflower patch that's kind of wild and just does its own thing, and I've noticed that there are lots of pollinators on it in the summer, but I have no idea what they are.
There's some really good ones. Bees in your backyard. You just showed me the foldy one, and I think and it was on Bee City, Brandon.
Okay.
Remember the Western Guide to Backyard Bees? I think
Yes.
it's called?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Is that a Peterson field guide kind of thing, or is it?
Yeah, it's a field guide,
yeah,
sort of like
it's
Peterson's.
kind of a one pager that folds up.
Oh,
But
yeah.
Bees in Your Backyard is probably one of the best ones. It's a little pricey because it's about maybe $45 or something. It's so worth it though. It really is.
And
you can
Xerxes
get it in
is
chapters. Oh yeah, and Xerxes is fantastic. And it's all online. Bees Are Us, which is a silly name for the website, but Lawrence Packer, the Packer Lab in York, he doesn't have descriptions of the bees, he just has the list of the bees, but then he has pictures of all the bees. So that one's really good, but yeah.
There's also, if you like to get into citizen science, there's the Bumblebee Watch app.
Yeah.
Where I think they help you identify and you also report the bees. Is that
Yeah.
how it works? I have
Yeah.
always wanted to, but then when I'm trying to get the photo, the bee never works. So.
That is a tough thing, and I know sometimes people are horrified when I say that we do, we kill the bees, right? Sorry, we kill the bees. I just told you to protect all your bees, and then I just murdered all the bees, like 26,000 bees in our last study. But a lot of them, in order to identify them, you have to put them under a microscope, and to tell the difference between a bee, a wasp, a fly, you have to put them underneath a microscope. The bumblebees are easier, and one thing that you find, if you do decide that you want to catch a few bees, you can aerial net them, or you can just stand really quietly with a vial and put it over top of the bee, and the bee will fly up into the vial, which sounds crazy, but neither myself nor any of my students have ever been stung. Yeah. Knock on wood on that one. Catching bees, they're really quite docile. Yeah. Honeybees are aggressive, because they're the only ones that live in hives, right? They're also the only ones that make honey. No native bees make honey, just an FYI. And it's because part of their protective thing is to release the hormone to get more bees to you, right? And they're going to sting you. But native bees, some of them, they will die if they sting you, and they're like your average single mother, right? If they die, then all their larvae die. So it is not something that they have built in as, that really is a last resort for a bee to sting you, so they generally don't sting you.
You mentioned that the honeybees really aren't as good a pollinator as the native bees.
Yeah.
And yet you talk to so many bee producers, and that's where they put their hot boxes close to agricultural crops because they feel that their bees are pollinating that entire crop. What is actually happening? Is there actually native bees on the edge, and then the big honeybees go out into the middle?
Even in the presence of hives, about 85% of the pollination is done by native bees. That to the exclusion of, say, those big massive orchards like down in the States where it is nothing but hundreds of acres of almond trees or things like that, where there are no native pollinators left.
Yeah.
Because there is no native habitat left. There is nothing but monoculture crops. Yeah. So then they have to bring in bees. So far in Canada, we don't have that quite as much, where we're using domestic bees for pollination. Usually our domestic bees are used for honey production. Yeah. You do see a bump in some areas, but as an example, for apples, mason bees are about 5 to 10 times, depending on the species, more effective at pollinating apples than honeybees. Okay. With alfalfa, for example, they use leafcutter bees, but leafcutter bees are a native bee. They're magicile. And the interesting difference between a leafcutter bee and a honeybee is that in order to pollinate an alfalfa flower, the bee has to go in from the front, and it triggers the stamen and everything, and it bonks the bee on the head, right? And sprinkles all the pollen and everything like that. And that's what they absolutely need in order for pollination to occur. Well, honeybees don't like getting bonked on the head, so they tend to go in from the side. So the average honeybee will only trip about 5% of the alfalfa flowers that they go into, whereas
The leaf
leafcutter will do
design
about
for that, yeah.
85 to 90% will trip. So if they're not tripped, they will not pollinate and they will not produce alfalfa seed.
Mhm.
And that's, you know, why they put leafcutter bees
Yeah.
in with the alfalfa. So it's really quite stark, the difference between, you know, the ability to pollinate, because you hear so much about honeybees, but you know, it's like trying to replace an entire suite of species with one species. You can't do that, right? When you think about the infinite variety in shapes and mechanisms of flowers, well, you need all those different species of bees in order to get the pollination.
You mentioned that study that 85% is native, and then the honeybees maybe do the rest of the 15. And that was like let's say North American study somewhere, like, or where, like
Oh yeah.
somewhere else, but not in Manitoba, but somewhere in Canada or the States where that comes
Yeah,
from.
it's kind of an aggregate of meta studies where they looked at
Okay.
all the different, because different crops have different insect dependencies, right? Everything from things, you know, that absolutely don't need insects to ones that are 100%, like onion seed and, you know, things like watermelons, tomatoes. Could have included more Aggie stuff in there. The ones that are really highly dependent on insects, you know, those would need different types of species to help with that pollination. For example, anything in tomatoes, a whole bunch of those, they need what's called buzz pollination or sonication. And so only certain species of native bee do that, like a bumblebee, adrenids, agapostemons, things like that. And what that is they go into the center of the flower and they kind of grip it, and then they buzz their wings super hard, and it causes static electricity, and it causes the flower to release the pollen, and the pollen sticks to the bee, and then they leave. And certain plants will not get pollinated unless they are buzz pollinated.
There's probably no video of
honeybee
that.
doesn't do that.
There's probably no video of that.
I have a video on my phone and on my Instagram.
That should be shown on TV.
Yeah.
And then we get,
Oh, it's
this is
super
really
cool.
what happens. you
Yeah.
know?
Oh, if you just stand by the side of the ditch and watch, you know, like roses.
Yeah, all you're doing is
You know, like wild roses, the little bumblebees go on, and you just videotape them. I mean, and you can go this close to them, they don't care.
Yeah.
And you can hear it, and it's super loud, which is interesting because that's sometimes, you know, the loudness of a bumblebee, people get kind of scared by them, but it's actually it's intentional. Their wings have special structures on them that rub together, and it makes their wings louder. But it's so it creates that static electricity so that when they land on a plant, then the pollen sticks to them better, right? It's, you know, it's all meant to do that. It's not meant to scare you. It's meant to cause a friction. Yeah. I could talk about this all night, so I know that there are snacks, and I'm sure that Allison wants to say some stuff.
Oh, that's-